To apply the bias, I am using glass head pins because I will need to press this before I stitch, and you don't want to use a plastic head pin because it could melt under the iron. Once I get it all pinned in place, I'm going to be using my Roxanne's glue Baste It. It's a temporary washout basting glue to hold the spaghetti bias down and keep it from shifting around. And once that dries, it'll be ready to stitch. So you always want to work on a hard surface. So I've just used my smaller cutting mat and I've slid it underneath in between the layers of the dress so that I can pin my spaghetti bias on. And I like to trim off the very edge where I turned it because that can be messy. And then you want to start in the back of the dress. I always start at the least visible place so that if something isn't quite as accurate as something else as you go along, you've got your best showing on the front. So I'm going to kind of pin this in place, starting at the center back and just curving it over the lines that we drew. And when I get to this one, I want to put a pin right at that intersection. I'm going to move this over a little bit, and here's where it gets a little trickier, because you want to curve your bias around this curve, and I'll have to see if this will work. This was my idea and I'd like to make it work, but the outside edge has to stay flat and the inside edge will have to be pulled in a little bit. So I guess I need to start out here and keep that. I may need to make these loops a little bit bigger, and that's okay. I'm just kind of stabbing in along the outside. I'm not pinning the inside of the loop over yet. And then when I get back here, I'm going to remove this pin and stick it through everything. Okay, that looks okay, but as you can see, it's a little bit bunchy in the middle. So what I'm going to do to help and see if I can smooth that out is to run a thread through the folded edge and try to pull that in a little bit. I'm using a contrast thread so that I will be able to easily pull it out. So I'm just going in and out. Hope you can see what I'm doing here. On the folded edge of the loop. So here you can see I've run that thread on the inside fold of the spaghetti bias, and now I'm going to do just like what we do with lace shaping, and I'm going to gently pull this to get that shape to fall into place with as few puckers as possible. And I think that looks good. I'm going to cut this off and just leave a tail there, because after this is pressed and it's securely in place and I've glued it, I'm going to pull this thread out before I start stitching. So now that it's in place, I can make sure that the needles come, or the pins are going in on the outside and coming out on the inside to secure that loop in place. I was finding it a little difficult to just use the hardboard because of the need to stab the pins into something, so I switched over to my little quilter's cut and press, because I can use the stab on the one side and then I can flip it over to the hard surface for the pinning of the straight sides. So it's a little bit of flipping around, but it does make the job a little bit easier. And as I approach this next loop that I'm making, you do want to measure to ensure that you're getting the same size loops for each one. So this is slightly over 1.25 inches, and I want to make sure, yeah, that looks about the same. So you want to do that as you go around the skirt. But like I said, I'm going to use this stab method, and then I can flip over to the straight side for pinning this section. Here I have the second loop pinned, and I thought I would show once more that to get the inside to form correctly to this little circle I'm doing, I just gently pull on this thread that I've woven through the fold of the fabric, and it closes up quite nicely. Before I unpin this and decide this is the shape, I'm going to measure again to make sure they're exactly the same. I've worked my way around the skirt, and now I am back at the starting point, at the first one. So I have trimmed off the bias band, and now I need to just tuck it underneath the other bias band and make sure that the ends will be covered. So that looks pretty good. So that is how you end off your bias strips. You always want to make sure it gets tucked underneath something, and that way it looks continuous. And if at any point you wanted to be working with shorter strips of bias, that's how you would do it. You would just make sure that you cut them off and join them underneath. With all of the loops finished, at this point I'm going to take it down to the iron and give it a good press. I'll probably spritz out some of the blue marks so that I get a better visual to make sure that I like the way all of the loops are looking. And if that's the case, then I'll be back and we can start gluing. I've pressed all of my spaghetti bias and the loops, and I am now ready to use my glue baste to glue this down so that I can remove the pins. So to do that, I'll just take a small section, and you can even use your blue mark underneath as a guide, but just put a few little dots of glue along there, and then you can replace the bias. Got a little bit out there, and just press it. And this glues fairly quickly, but if you're in a hurry to get all the way around a skirt, you can do a section and then you can iron it. And especially if you iron from the wrong side, the glue will dry very quickly. So even in these loop areas, you can just put a little dab underneath here to secure it, and then you can pull the pins out as you work your way around. And you can see I've got this setting on a hard plastic surface again. I'm using my cutting mat because you need something to have this rest against, and I don't want glue on my tablecloth. So I have glued all of my bias down, and I've removed the little black threads from inside because I want to make sure those don't get caught in the stitching. One thing I did want to remind you, I did use the iron to help dry the glue more quickly. If you're going to do that, be sure you do not use steam, because remember, our glue is a water-soluble glue, and if you're using steam, steam is moisture, so you'll kind of defeat the purpose. The glue will not hold as well if you use steam when you're trying to press it dry. So now we are ready to stitch, and it's a matter of deciding what stitch you want to use to secure your spaghetti bias. The quickest and easiest method is just to use a straight stitch, and you would straight stitch on the inside of the loops and on the outside of the loops all around the dress. And that may be what you choose to do. That works just fine. If you are going to use that, I would recommend using a 60 weight thread in a color that will best be camouflaged with the fabrics that you've chosen. So if that's what I was going to do on this dress, I would use a white thread. And you want to try to be accurate with your stitching. It is a little bit tricky, but if you go slowly, you can get nice stitched results with a straight stitch. Most of the garments that I've shown you where I've used spaghetti bias trim, I have stitched it down using a blanket stitch. That's a very basic stitch, and I believe every sewing machine would have that. And that is a stitch that goes forward once, and then it zigzags once, going back into that same hole. Then it goes forward once, and it zigzags once. If you're going to do that, you probably will need to adjust your settings, because typically the zigzag stitch is quite wide, and you only want it to just barely go in and catch your spaghetti bias. You don't want a great big zigzag stitch going into it. I also would highly recommend using a water-soluble stabilizer behind the fabric when you do this stitching. You will always get prettier stitches if you stabilize behind any of your decorative stitches. And since all my other products are water-soluble, I also use the water-soluble stabilizer. So to do the blanket stitch hem like these two dresses have on them, I would recommend using the Metler 60 weight thread, and then the size 70. I prefer the Microtex, but a universal needle will work also. And then the stabilizer that I prefer to use is the Sulky Super Solvy. This looks more like interfacing, and it's heavier than the Saran Wrap version of Solvy. I know different brands also make their water-soluble stabilizer that looks similar to this. Those would work as well. But you would just want to cut strips of this to put behind the area that you're going to blanket stitch. So, 2-inch strips of this would work fine. And then set your blanket stitch settings to about a 2.5 stitch length, and reduce the zigzag width to a 1.0. And then you're going to want to have the straight stitch go right next to the spaghetti bias, and then the little zigzag will just catch it and hold it in place. So I have finished the dress. I have the stitching finished, and I wanted to give you a chance to see a nice close-up of what this stitching looks like on the dress. I've also rinsed it in cold water to remove all of the blue washout markings that I had on the dress. And then I continue to just ensure that all of the stabilizer rinsed out of the back of the dress, because that takes a little bit longer. You may also need to rinse it out with a little bit of detergent, but you want to make sure that you have first rinsed out all the blue marks before any detergent hits this fabric. Otherwise your blue marks will turn into little brown marks that are permanent. So you can see how pretty this ended up turning out, and how beautifully the stitches are. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learning a little bit about spaghetti bias and how to shape it and the application, and can use it on future projects that you have. If you've enjoyed this video and don't want to miss out on future videos, please consider hitting the subscribe button below.